There we go, Mr. Chairman. Bill, I'd like to introduce you, if you haven't met him yet, to Dan Pedersen, who is the Medicare compliance expert at PWWAG and our very knowledgeable speaker. Did you want to say a couple of introductory words, either Bill or Dan, and then you're off and running?
No, it's just great to have you. Thanks for doing this, Dan. It'll be a big help for everyone in AIMHI, that's for sure.
All right. Well, thank you for having me, Matt. Thank you for inviting me. I guess Matt kind of teed up this session, 10 things you must do to ensure with Medicare compliance. And I guess he sent around something around the office and I kind of got voluntold for this. But I didn't mind because, this is kind of my bailiwick. This is the kind of thing that I deal with on a day-to-day basis at, PWW and PWWAG. A little bit quickly about me, kind of this as the image there, a jack of all trades. Yes, I am an attorney and a consultant with AG, worked for PWW as the law firm, 20 years now plus. Speaker, things like this, doing the NAC speaking circuit, doing the ABC 360 conference circuit, other events and things like that. A writer of sorts. I mean, I've written a fair share of different articles in the different publications, certainly not as prolific as Doug, Steve, Matt, and even some of you guys as well. I've written a few, so I'll put writer there on my little resume here too. I like to think of myself too as kind of this problem solver. Um, when clients come to me with some question, some issue, whether it's with a payer, whether it's a Medicare issue, whether it's a reimbursement issue, whatever, just it's kind of just diving in and trying to figure out what is going on. And so I kind of like that role of problem solver. And of course, Matt already teed up the expert, but I put that in a question mark there. Is anybody really an expert? I also like to think that, we're always continually learning, and certainly 20 years of doing this myself. In the Medicare world and reimbursement, there's always changes. There's always new things to learn about. There's always stuff to learn. So, no one's really an expert until you just keep on learning more and more and more. So the content of this, where I got a lot of this from is, of course, PWW, the law firm, PWWAG, we do a lot of audit work, audit activity, working with appeals then of Medicare overpayment denial issues, dealing with TPE audits for our clients and things like that. So, a lot of this has just come from, things I see over the years in the audit work and audit activity that I do in the appeals that we've then handled on behalf of our clients, exclusively with the Medicare is what I'm trying to focus on here, because obviously they're a big payer. Although Medicare Advantage is creeping up and have just pretty much surpassed Medicare Part B. So some of the big risk areas that we've seen over the years. So I've kind of just organized this that way. Of course, the OIG is a big issue now too. And what we've been doing recently with both the law firm and AG is a lot of OIG self-disclosure issues where there's been something that's been detected as a problem, as an overpayment liability, going and using that OIG self-disclosure protocol as opposed to just refunding to individual payers. And in fact, some of these examples and situations that I'll talk about are actually some real life situations where we have used that OIG self-disclosure protocol. So before we start, kind of the dad joke here, a shameless plug. So, the plug with the bikini and then they've lost the bikini. Anyway, we've got PWWAG coming out with very soon the National EMS Documentation Survey report. This will be hitting the airwaves fairly soon. I know Doug worked on this a lot, Shannon Golnick, Matt Zavadsky, you've had your fingers in this as well. What exactly is this? There's all the words we've used. I took that straight out of the report, kind of getting, good, solid information, realities of field level documentation issues from across the board, the field providers, management, billers and coders, and try to get, where some of these issues are and where some of the problems might be, the defects, the deficiencies, where do we have to have some more training and other things like that. So hopefully that'll kind of become some degree of that light bulb moment, the wake up call, the eureka moment, the aha moment, whatever you want to call it, because I think it will be pretty enlightening for a lot of folks just to see kind of some of these issues that people have raised. And of course, this is something that'll continue to grow and develop over time, as more people participate and then, more people start adding some more feedback to this. So it'll be some pretty interesting, good data. All right, so enough of my little introductory remarks. Without further ado, in the spirit of our friend David Letterman, where Matt and I were just talking before everybody joined on, David Letterman doesn't look like that anymore. He looks like Santa Claus now with his long gray beard. Anyway, so our top 10 list of things to ensure some Medicare compliance. Diving right into it. And what I've done here too is I've kind of put this in the order of the way things go, not like best to worst or worst to best or funniest to least funniest, whatever order you want to do it in, but kind of just the way the life of a claim, starting then with call intake and dispatch and going through post payment audit activity, things like that. So starting with that first thing, when a call first comes in, our call intake and dispatch and things like your CAD software. And a lot of these CAD software programs, whether it's APCO, whether it's MPDS, ProQA, they're pretty powerful tools, and they've got a lot of things that you can do with them. And I think what I've learned over the years is that not everybody takes most advantage of that. You might go through and you get all these questions through ProQA, you get assigned a code, it's a 26A4, it's a 6D5, it's whatever. But then, the only thing that seems to bleed through to the crews is ALS response, priority one. Or, just kind of everything defaults to a sick person, even though you've got all these powerful pieces of information. So, why are we only kind of giving limited information at times? So kind of this big tip is, use all of that software the way you can. One example I've given there, kind of some of the differences between card 33 and card 37. And the card 37 in your MPDS is a relatively new one. And at first, I think it was designed to replace card 33, but then they got some feedback and folks wanted to continue using that card 33. There's a question. I've always thought that card 33 was more of a non-emergency type situation. Whereas I think some of the MPDS folks said, no, card 33 was intended to be another emergency type situation. Card 37 was more non-emergency. And certainly there have been people that have been adopting these cards, using one, using both. Some of the lingo that they start using now on card 37 is evaluation versus a transfer, and moving a patient for eval versus transfer. And what the heck does some of this stuff mean? The big thing with these dispatch conditions become emergency versus non-emergency and how you're ultimately going to bill this. So some of your, I shouldn't say some of, I should say all of your billing decisions to Medicare really are contingent on some of the first information that you get at the time of call intake and dispatch in deciding whether you're going to bill this at the emergency or non-emergency level. So if you're not getting good call intake and dispatch decisions and information, it can tank your whole billing process at the end of the day. So getting that good documentation and of course sharing that information becomes so important. As I said, you get all this good stuff and you get a specific code and Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, and the specific condition and specific secondary conditions, yet you give very minimal information to the crew and to the billers, and it really is hurting your billing decisions. Number 9. Of course, a mantra that I have started using the past few years: you mean what you say and say what you mean. And the biggest thing I see about this is with the crew members and some of the lingo that they use when they say this was a non-emergency response or a non-emergency transport. And what they're really trying to say is emergency response or emergency transport means we activated lights and sirens. And non-emergency transport or non-emergency response means we didn't activate lights and sirens. The problem then is what happens when they document this was a non-emergency transport. Medicare reviewers see that and they say, well, your crew member said it was a non-emergency transport. Why did you bill this at the emergency type of service? And we've seen time and time again, these Medicare reviewers downcode it to a non-emergency payable service when you clearly satisfied all of your emergency response definitions and emergency response requirements under the Medicare rules. And so it's, using the wrong lingo. If you mean to say we activated lights or sirens or didn't activate lights and sirens, say that. If you've got a priority 1 is lights and sirens, priority 2 is no lights and sirens, say priority 1 or 2, because honestly, lights and sirens don't mean a hill of beans, but certainly these words emergency and non-emergency mean different things to dispatchers, crew members, and then especially billers, and then more especially these Medicare reviewers. So it's very important to kind of think about this mode of response, activating lights and sirens, versus kind of the nature of the call versus the way it was originally dispatched, meeting that Medicare definition of emergency response, responding immediately at the 911 call or equivalent based on the dispatch condition. So all this stuff ties together, and it's so important to really think about what these words mean and how they might have different meanings amongst the different people involved in the process. All right, number 8, the importance of good crew documentation. This even bounces back to what I led off with the coming soon kind of EMS report. It is this phrase that we've used at PWW and in the NAC courses and the CADS course that we do. Honestly complete and completely honest with all of that EPCR documentation. That second bullet there where it talks about avoiding contradictions. This is something we see time and time again in the Medicare audit process where these reviewers absolutely love to find some contradiction, whether it's between a PCR and a PCS, whether it's on the internal information on your PCR, where you say, oh, here it says GCS of 15. Over here it says confused and alert and oriented times 2. Which is it? And certainly if you are, confused and a decreased GCS and alert and oriented times 2, it might help support medical necessity. But that reviewer is going to say, but here you told me they had a GCS of 15. They can't be confused if they got a GCS of 15. They're not confused. You haven't proven that they need an ambulance. And they use that discrepancy against you and trying to ultimately say, sorry, we don't think medical necessity is met here because your documentation is just poor. So it's why it becomes so important to proofread. And that last bullet, I am not trying to say that every transport must meet medical necessity, because certainly there's going to be a heck of a lot of transports that don't meet medical necessity. Obviously, when you're billing to a payer like Medicare, you need to meet that seminal criteria of medical necessity, and your documentation needs to support that. But certainly there's going to be trips where medical necessity simply isn't met, and where your documentation is honestly complete and completely honest. That's all we can ask the crew members to do. It's up to the billers to make sure they ultimately bill it correctly based on that thorough documentation that the crew members have provided. Number 7, this is a big one that's been popping up a lot, more so on some of the kind of proactive audits that folks have done and things that they've detected with respect to crew certifications. And it's not just their current active EMS certification card, with BLS or paramedic or whatever level of certification they have, but, ancillary requirements in that, you must also have a CPR card, and that CPR card becomes invalid or they fail to renew that one. And to what extent does that tank their current certification at the BLS or ALS level and their paramedic certification? Driver's licenses that have been maybe temporarily suspended or revoked or whatever. And this is someone who is a driver for your ambulance company, and now they've got a driver's license suspension. We just had a case recently in Florida where the reason for that suspension was that the person failed to pay their insurance on their personal vehicle. And in Florida, that impacted their driver's license. Your failure to pay insurance causes your driver's license to become suspended. And this person continued to drive the ambulance, not even aware that their driver's license was suspended. It resulted in overpayments because you didn't meet state law requirements of having a valid driver's license for that particular driver. Another big thing that just came up recently too is this OIG list of excluded individuals and entities, LEIE list. We just had a case where 2 ambulance services didn't even know their obligation to have to check that. And in fact, this person was working for 2 different ambulance services part-time. This person actually didn't even know that they were on the OIG exclusion list. They'd been on it for something like 10 years. And now all of a sudden this came to light, and now we're trying to work with that, trying to get this person reinstated, perhaps trying to even get this person retroactively reinstated so that transports performed when this person was excluded might not result in a refund of overpayments. Another one people often ignore is any Medicaid exclusion list. That OIG list doesn't always get updated immediately. It doesn't always catch everything. Heck, there might be a more minor infraction that causes someone to get excluded under the Medicaid program that might not trigger an OIG exclusion. So it's important to check all these different lists and check and make sure everybody's credentials are absolutely up to date, because this is such an easy way for there to become a huge overpayment liability and a significant problem if people fail to maintain their required certifications. Another big one that pops up is this claim submission authorization signature capture. Sometimes we call it the assignment of benefits. Sometimes it's, the PWW model form, section 1, 2, and 3. Of course, we look at it in the regulations at 42 CFR 424.36. And, A for the patient signature, B1 through B5 for representative, B6 when it's the crew member and the receiving facility combination. So all that stuff, all those requirements. And I mean, some people look at this as kind of a very silly ministerial type thing, but nonetheless, it's still a requirement. Yes, people say, yeah, but we've got mandatory assignment anyway with EMS and ambulance, and Medicare is going to pay us directly. Why the heck do we still need to capture the signature? Unfortunately, that's what the rules say. It's what we need to make sure that we are compliant with. Unfortunately, we've seen a host of signature issues pop up in both audits by Medicare and other payers. OIG has gotten involved in some of these as well, but also self-audits where you detect a problem. We've had several cases where there have just been some suspicious time entries, times where an alleged patient signature was captured some 2 or 3, even 4 hours after the call was closed. So was this really a case of the crew went back to the hospital and said, hey, patient, we forgot to get your signature when you dropped you off. Can you sign this now? And I'm pretty darn well sure that was not going on. What the crew does is say, oh, crap, we forgot to get the signature. And someone says, well, who the heck knows what their signature looks like? Just put a little chicken scrawl through there, and there you go. You've got a signature, and we've got it. Unfortunately, that system, timestamps when the signatures are captured, and it certainly looks suspicious. Is there some degree of forgery? Certainly there could be. We've handled at least 3 or 4 cases with OIG self-disclosure protocols where that has been the issue, and a voluntary refund has been made because you failed to satisfy these signature requirements. Another big thing we see is people signing in the wrong box. We get a crew member who signs the patient attestation section language of section 1 or section A, where it can't be the patient that's actually, or it can't be the crew member that's signing this language. They are not the patient. They are not authorizing their health information to be submitted. Same thing happens with, the crew member may be signing as a representative of the patient, that B1 through B4 or B5 kind of reasons. The only way the crew is signing is under that 42 CFR 424.36 B6 section, where they are attesting that the patient is physically or mentally incapable of signing. So anytime they're signing the wrong language, it's technically not meeting the requirements of the regulation. And, any of these can lead to problems if you don't have that valid signature. You don't have technical permission to be submitting that claim to Medicare in the first place, and it can represent an overpayment. A lot of faulty reasons we see also as to why patients allegedly can't sign, where they put things like, oh, weakness, or, contamination, or patient requested that someone else sign. Remember, when some representative is going to sign on behalf of the patient, it must be because that patient is physically or mentally incapable of signing. Not that they didn't want to sign, not that they were. So, I mean, how weak do you have to be unable to hold a pen or a stylus and sign your name, even if it's just an X? So, I mean, how you can say weakness prevents them from signing is probably pretty difficult. Now, granted, if they've got such severe contractures and their hand is all cramped up, yes. Can I buy into that? Absolutely. The other big thing we see is then contradictions. You've got a GCS of 15, alert and orient times 4, no neurological problems. The assessment shows that their extremities are all normal and no abnormalities. Yet when it comes time to sign, it says patient is physically unable to sign. Well, how does that comport with what the rest of your PCR said? And we get people arguing with us about that all the time. Well, the crew made that decision. Well, the crew made the decision when it was time to capture a signature. Why didn't they have any similar information documented on the rest of their patient care report? So a lot of these signature problems, they seem simplistic, they seem mundane, they seem ministerial, but they certainly can lead to problems and cause and trigger overpayments. Number 5, crew signatures. Best practice dictates that both or even all crew members involved in the care of the patient should be signing the PCR. Sometimes state law plays a role in this. Sometimes state law does say the patient, the PCR only requires one crew member, and usually the lead crew member. However, the way we look at this is kind of best practice gets to that last bullet where we talk about the Medicare Program Integrity Manual, where that speaks to persons who perform or provide or order services must sign. With an ambulance transport, it takes at least 2 to tango, right? You've got a driver up front and you've got a crew member in the back. Those are the people who are collectively providing the ambulance transport that you are now billing. So both the driver and both the lead crew member should be signing. And the drivers love to give this. Well, I don't know what happened in the back of the vehicle. I'm not asking you to tell me what happened in the back of the vehicle. I'm asking you to attest to the fact that you were the driver. I'm asking your partner to attest to the fact that they were in the back rendering care, providing interventions, doing whatever they were doing. Because it takes 2 to tango for a covered ambulance Medicare claim. The other thing I see often is, maybe some of these joint responses, maybe sometimes you got a fire department that comes along, maybe it's an ALS, BLS joint billing issue. But now you've got certain people there who are doing all of these interventions on scene, but then you've only got the driver and the lead crew member who ultimately accompany the patient as being the ones who sign. And then you've got all these interventions that were performed by other people documented on the flow chart, but none of those people sign. I'm a pretty big advocate for getting as many people to sign, especially when they've been performing some sort of service or intervention for the patient, because we have seen cases where these Medicare reviewers say, you don't meet the appropriate signature requirements and that you've only got one person signing for this, and you need to have proof that 2 people actually rendered the care. The other big thing we like to recommend here is that, you don't sign it until it's been proofread. And so many times we see, spelling issues, inconsistencies, mistakes, sloppy documentation, vital signs that might clearly be wrong, where just, a quick proofread of it before both people sign off on that can really go a long way to fix some of these problems with the documentation. Because again, poor documentation leads to poor billing decisions, leads to the potential for overpayment, which leads to compliance problems, which is why we're talking about all of this stuff. All right, number 4, solidify some of your billing decisions. And what do I mean by this? Certainly, there's a lot to be thinking about. There's our HCPCS codes, there's our modifiers, there's our ICD-10 codes. We've got to think about the ALS assessment rule. We've got times we can use transport indicators. And yeah, the HCPCS codes are really the thing that drives the train and drives the reimbursement. ICD-10 codes become a necessary evil here when it comes to ambulance billing. It's required by Medicare, but it really doesn't mean all that much. For Medicare purposes, true. For other payers, we see other payers really dive into these ICD-10 codes and make a big fuss about it and saying that, oh, well, this ICD-10 code is inconsistent with what you had on your HCPCS code based on these condition codes and this and that. And they go back to the Novitas suggested ICD-10 code list from that old LCD and LCA, which is now retired by Novitas, but plenty of other commercial insurers have bought into that concept. You've got other commercial insurers that are doing their own thing and making their own rules about this. So, you really got to know what you're doing and why you're doing it, and follow the particular rules, requirements, standards, guidance for the different payers out there, and just make sure you're doing things correctly. Obviously, Medicare recognizes the concept of the ALS assessment rule. Very few other payers out there recognize that. We had some cases years ago now in Pennsylvania Medicaid where these ambulance services were saying, yeah, we build this at the ALS level because of an ALS assessment. Pennsylvania Medicaid says, what the heck is an ALS assessment? So, oh yeah, Medicare allows it. Here's the Medicare regulation. Well, we're not Medicare. We're a Medicaid payer. Here's our regulations that don't say anything about this concept of an ALS assessment. Yeah, but you're CMS, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. No, we at least follow, we give some support to the state Medicaid, but they are their own thing for choosing how things get paid and at what level and things like that. The other big thing is, finding that correct payer and billing the right payer, in the right order. We worry about, workers' comp and third-party liability and auto accidents. Just because someone hands you a Medicare card doesn't mean that Medicare is the proper payer. Same thing goes with facility. And is this a patient in a SNF Part A stay that's maybe the responsibility of the SNF? Is this a patient in a hospital that has inpatient status and they're going somewhere for temporary care and then coming back? Do they have the inpatient stay as they're going from the freestanding ED over to the mothership for admission, and they've already been admitted and ordered to be admitted, such that this is maybe, the financial responsibility of the hospital? All these different things we need to think about and worry about. We don't just bill someone and say, oh, if they don't want to pay it, they won't pay it. Remember, Medicare especially is what's called a pay first, ask questions later kind of payer. And that as long as it's a clean claim, they'll pay it. I'll talk a little bit more about some exceptions where Medicare might not be paying, which is why then we do have to pursue appeals. And that's going to be one of the future ones. Another big thing, that last bullet there, is defaults that might exist in your billing software, and even being aware of those defaults. Those ambulance certification questions, patient bed confined before and after, transport medically necessary. We've seen time and time again where some of the billing softwares inadvertently or on purpose have set certain answers. But obviously, if the patient is not bed confined, we shouldn't be answering that question as yes. Obviously, if the patient was not admitted to the hospital, we shouldn't be answering that as yes. Obviously, if medical necessity is not met, we should not automatically be answering that as yes. We should have all of these maybe defaulted to no and have to manually change it to a yes at some point. Same thing with destination reasons. This is a big thing that's popped up where you see these questions on the EPCRs where it says, why did the patient go to this facility? And it's, things like physician preference, patient choice, nearest appropriate facility. Obviously, Medicare only pays for transport to that nearest appropriate facility, but many times that nearest appropriate facility is also the patient choice. And of course, the crew member wants to give the patient their choice. They don't want to be accused of kidnapping or doing something against the patient's will or not honoring the patient's wishes. So they're going to document patient choice. But to Medicare, then Medicare says, well, this was a patient choice. This is excess mileage. The patient could have gone somewhere else, but you went to a more distant facility. Why should Medicare pay for all the mileage to this patient choice situation? So again, be really, really careful with some of the defaults, really, really careful to understand what these questions are really getting at and the reason for some of these questions in the underlying billing software, and even who's answering some of those questions. We've got cases where the PCR and the billing software kind of talk to each other, and you've got the NEMSIS requirements and you've got all this different stuff going on. And certainly certain questions that are posed on the EPCR for NEMSIS, for other reasons, whatever, bleed over and become some of your billing decisions, and certainly can pose some problems. All right, number 3, beware of claims posting and processing. Kind of another thing with defaults almost here is that, there's this concept of batch posting where the computer kind of does all the dirty work. I still strongly believe that there needs to be a degree of some human involvement there to be able to just check for issues, check for problems, see why something might have been denied, or more importantly, whether it's a denial or a rejection, because that's a critical distinction. When you have something that's been denied by a payer like Medicare, you're able to pursue an appeal. If it's rejected, it's not ripe for an appeal. You need to fix the problem that caused the rejection, and you are allowed to resubmit the claim. And so, you're not going to resubmit a claim for a denial. You're going to appeal a denial. You're not going to appeal a rejection. You're going to fix the problem and correct that by submitting some new claim. that addresses the issue. So all too often, I do see situations where folks kind of get confused between these concepts of a denial and a rejection. It even harkens back to that other lesson of mean what you say and say what you mean. And so important to know the distinction between all these different words and phrases that we have, with denials, rejections, emergency, non-emergency, lights and sirens, no lights and sirens, and all these different things that we need to keep straight in our head, because these tiny little nuances really do make a big difference at times. All righty, number 2. I kind of segued into this a little bit earlier, but the importance of pursuing appeals. And I said before, Medicare is a pay first, ask questions later, and they will kind of pay clean claims. However, there have been situations, especially as of late, where maybe Medicare is inappropriately denying. The biggest example of this is that SNF Part A issue. And this stems from something that first started in 2018. And in fact, it's got its history way back in 2009 or so. The most recent OIG audits in 2018 were looking at cases where Medicare Part B was billed for certain SNF patients where the SNF was actually responsible. Many of these were obvious cases where Medicare should not have been billed because they were trips to a doctor's office. They were trips for services that were clearly part of the SNF Part A bundle, consolidated billing services that are the financial responsibility of the SNF and are never billable to Medicare Part B. But these ambulance services perhaps didn't know or recognize or realize some of the differences. The problem is that this whole concept is written a little bit backwards in that it says, you bill Medicare Part B for SNF exclusions. So the exclusion means that the SNF is not financially responsible, so you're allowed to bill Medicare Part B. Some of these things are very obvious, like the dialysis trips, like a transport to a hospital for emergency services in the ED, for some higher level care services, CT scans, MRIs, things like that. Some of them are also kind of obvious on the flip side of, hey, this is a patient in a SNF and you're now moving them somewhere else to have, a routine blood draw or to have their adult diaper changed or to have, a follow-up physician's appointment. Why are we moving the patient? Why aren't we bringing the service to the patient, especially when it's something that can be provided at the SNF? Why the SNF is getting that, Part A pot of money. So it's very nuanced, and this concept of what's covered by the SNF, what's covered by Medicare Part B, and these exceptions and exclusions. The problem is because it is so nuanced and because there are these exceptions, it's hard for the Medicare computer system to really create some kind of edit that will really be able to clearly go through all these exceptions. So one thing that Medicare had done was kind of really tighten these edits and almost look at any patient who is in a SNF Part A stay. They'll almost deny any of those trips saying, well, it's impossible for anyone other than the SNF to be responsible because they're in the SNF Part A stay. Certainly, having that tight edit might be correct and might be the fix and might fix things from being inappropriately billed to and paid by Medicare. In other cases, it does fall into one of these exceptions such that Medicare Part B is indeed the correct payer. What we've realized and learned and figured out over time is that sometimes this becomes a function of how quickly the ambulance claim gets submitted versus a hospital claim. So for example, maybe this patient is in the SNF Part A stay, first 100 days of the SNF stay, and now they fall, they get hurt, possible fractured hip, ambulance is called, ambulance takes them to the hospital for emergency services. That ambulance claim then gets billed pretty darn quickly before the hospital claim ever gets billed. So according to Medicare's grand computer in the sky, Medicare says this patient's still sitting in a SNF. We have no record of them going anywhere else. So therefore, it's impossible for this ambulance transport to have occurred. So we can't pay this ambulance transport because as far as we know, the patient's still sitting in the SNF. So once that hospital bill then hits the Medicare floor, Medicare might say, oh, okay, yes, they did leave the SNF. They did get service at the hospital. Oh, I guess this ambulance transport can be payable because now we have corroborating evidence that the patient left the SNF and went to the hospital. Of course, Medicare is not going to go back after they've already denied that ambulance claim and figure all that out. So one piece of advice might be to really hold some of these SNF claims and heck, even some of your hospital to hospital transfers just a tad bit longer than you might have otherwise held a claim, just to make sure some other healthcare provider's claim hits the Medicare floor before yours, so Medicare can appropriately track the status of this patient and where they might be. Because of course, Medicare trusts the facilities a heck of a lot more than they do these ambulance services, and they will not take our word on it that the patient was moved from the SNF to the hospital or hospital to hospital. They want to see a claim from the corresponding facilities to prove all of that. Another thing, dealing with TPE, target, probe, and educate audits that have been taking place here. The importance of appealing your rounds 1, 2, and even 3. If you have a high error rate there, keeping that error rate lower, it's not going to prevent a future round, but if you still have a high error rate after round 3, your Medicare administrative contractor will refer it over to CMS, and CMS might do some more digging. But certainly if you've got proof that, hey, we pursued these appeals, these trips got paid on appeal, our error rate is not nearly as high as our MAC said it was, CMS will use that data and that information and say, you're right, so we have no further reason to explore this, to perform other audits or do other things. The other reason I always say that appeals are important is because, Medicare is not always right. Just because Medicare might deny something doesn't mean they're correct. And if you then start to fall in that trap, well, Medicare denied this, so therefore all other trips that we have that are like this, then Medicare says we can't bill those either. So we're just not going to bill those. It's very, very possible that Medicare is wrong. And just because Medicare said so, don't use that as a reason for changing your process. Same thing goes back to that TPE. Medicare and the TPE process have denied and downcoded a lot of trips. That's why you have the appeal rights. And on appeal, things greatly change and things are a heck of a lot different after the appeal. And so if you simply said, oh, Medicare says we were billing this wrong, okay, I guess we need to change our practices. And I had this happen. This was a city operation. They were only doing 911 trips. They had clear dispatch protocols in place, beautifully meeting the emergency response definition, clearly eligible for emergency type of service. But back from one of the earlier lessons, the crew members would say something like non-emergency transport, meaning, we didn't activate lights and sirens for the trip from the scene to the hospital. Medicare reviewers say, oh, this was a non-emergency trip. We're downcoding this to non-emergency. The other thing they even did was say, well, your crew documented that this patient's condition was not all that bad, and therefore this was not an emergency. Remember that Medicare definition of emergency response is all contingent on the dispatch protocol and the way in which you responded. If you were dispatched to cardiac arrest and you get there on scene and it's something different, you still met that emergency response definition. We don't get to now say, oh, this is only non-emergency because the patient's condition wasn't all that bad. So these Medicare reviewers are sometimes wrong. And I had this city that does all these 911 trips saying, well, we're going to be conservative and Medicare says we should bill these non-emergency, so we're going to bill them non-emergency now. And I said, hold on a second. If you're going to start billing non-emergency, what do you need for non-emergency billing? That's right, a PCS. How are you going to get all these PCS forms for these trips now to meet your Medicare non-emergency requirements? Oh, yeah, that's a good point. We didn't think about that. I said, yes, this is why we need to pursue appeals on these, that they're downcoding, because you've clearly met the emergency response definition, and you can't change your practices because of one faulty decision by one Medicare reviewer. You need to know the rules. You need to know the requirements. You need to make sure you're doing things correctly, because had they changed their practices, guess what would have happened? Now, their utilization rate would have all of a sudden influxed to non-emergency. They would have said, huh, this seems weird. You now have all these non-emergency trips. So instead of us auditing for all your emergency trips, we're going to audit for non-emergency trips now. And they're going to do this audit, and they're not going to find PCS forms, and they're going to say, sorry, not payable, no PCS forms. Your response of, well, you told us to do this, is not going to fly, because what Medicare loves to do is say, you as the healthcare provider, ambulance service, are responsible for complying with the rules and requirements, and you didn't do that. You can't fall back and say, well, Medicare told us to. All right, our last one, perform routine proactive auditing. And what do I mean by this? Internal audits, hiring some outside law firm, consulting firm, whomever, to get some of that outside neutral additional kind of viewpoint of things. Because certainly, yes, you do this in and out. You think you know the rules. Maybe you do know all the rules, but it's always nice to get a fresh set of eyes to look at things, to point out some areas of risk or flaw or whatever it might be, from signatures to medical necessity to processes to your call intake process to your dispatch protocols to your ICD-10 and HCPCS codes and modifier selections, all of that stuff, to have someone else from the outside take a peek at some of that. This is so important because it is one of the primary things that the OIG suggests as part of its compliance guidance. Having an effective compliance program, a big piece of that is performing routine audits. And yes, if you detect problems, if you detect overpayments, to make those voluntary refunds, whether you go back to the individual payer, whether you use that OIG self-disclosure protocol, whatever the case may be. Time and time again, I get folks that say, well, isn't this going to raise a red flag? Isn't this just going to trigger us into a different audit or a new audit, or for the OIG or CMS to find some bigger problem? And I always say no. And I always say I have never seen that happen. And the biggest reason why Medicare or the OIG would not initiate some additional or larger audit after a voluntary refund is because it becomes completely counterintuitive to the reason and the rationale and the purpose of doing voluntary refunds. The OIG and CMS want you to do the right thing, which includes performing these audits and making a refund when such a refund is warranted. If that's the right thing to do, if they then perform some other audit after that, they're effectively punishing you for doing the right thing. So in my experience, I've always seen kind of, the folks who go the OIG self-disclosure protocol route, the folks who go and make voluntary refunds, show that you are being compliant, that you're doing the right thing. I have never had a case in my 20 years of doing this where the OIG or the CMS comes back and says, well, you were willing to make this refund here. Where there's smoke, there's fire. I'm going to go find some more. Because again, it's completely counterintuitive. It's going to discourage people from making those refunds and doing the self audits when they want to encourage people to do that. The other thing about this kind of proactive auditing, you get to kind of control the narrative. You get to pick your sample. You get to pick when you do this. And as long as you are doing a good, solid review, finding problems, making refunds, and explain all of this, whether you're explaining it to the OIG through the self-disclosure protocol, whether you're explaining it to the individual payers, you're kind of controlling and saying what happens. Otherwise, your data looks suspicious, you've got a high error rate, you've got whatever problem, the government comes in, they get to call the shots, they get to do things, they get to snoop around, they get to find the problems, they get to hit you with a multi-million-dollar overpayment demand because they've been in control. By you doing the auditing, you figuring out the problems, you are totally running the show and controlling things on your own. So that's my whirlwind tour of kind of my top 10 list of things to help keep you compliant. I know I whipped through that pretty darn quick, but I had a lot of stuff that I wanted to try to cover. So that said, I will pause and take a well-deserved breather here. Queue up any questions if anybody's got them, and let it go back to Bill and Matt and everybody else and see if anyone wants to chime in with questions.
Well, I'll jump in with one on that example with the city audit, right? They questioned whether or not it was an emergency response versus a non-emergency response, and the cruise documentation there. I would think that they would be more likely to get to the issue of whether the emergency was medically necessary or not. Did they reach that, or how did that piece of it play out?
Yeah, good question. And I think they did agree that medical necessity was met, meaning that, the patient required the ambulance. But now it just became this bizarre thing of, was it billed at the emergency or non-emergency level? And the way they got there is this language in the Medicare Benefit Policy Manual, Chapter 10, Section 30.1, that outlines, all of the definitions from 42 CFR 414.605, and including this emergency response definition. And so in the manual, it gives this extra application and it talks all about the emergency response. It mirrors that definition, but then it goes into this thing about if there is no dispatch protocol, or if the dispatch protocol isn't used, or if this, that, and the other thing, then the patient's condition on scene determines the level of payment. So what they did was jump to that last little sentence that says the patient's condition on scene determines the level of payment. And what they ultimately said was this was a minor condition. I agree they needed an ambulance, but it was such a minor condition, it didn't need an emergency response. But of course, they were butchering the whole thing, and they ignored the fact that there was a dispatch protocol and there was the definition of emergency response met, and there was an immediate response to a dispatch condition pursuant to the dispatch protocol. They ignored all of that and jumped to this concept of patient condition on scene, and then made this ridiculously subjective conclusion of, oh, I don't think the condition was that bad, so we're going to call it a non-emergency. This was really a function of this reviewer not understanding the rules and the difference between emergency and non-emergency, and perhaps to an extent, not even understanding medical necessity, or just the way these things are in some cases different, in some cases the same, and just the way they love to pick and choose language and try to use it to best benefit them. And they chunked out a little sentence of patient condition on scene determines level of payment and applied it entirely wrong.
Yeah, to follow up on that, I mean, any of us that have ever spent any amount of time in the street, we respond to emergency calls all the time where, it's an emergency call, everyone's intent is good, and the patient, thinks they need an ambulance, right? But they can pretty much run the 100, right? And
Right.
boy, and I know that that's a big percentage of emergency calls. What has been your experience with that during audits or during individual circumstances where maybe the auditors or Medicare or the payer does give some deference to that reasonable layperson standard, or the patient believed they were sick or needed help. I think where I'm going.
Yep. The biggest thing is, our medical necessity definition is under the Social Security Act and under the Medicare regulations is that other forms of transport are contraindicated. And so, what the heck does that mean? And how do we put any more color into a statement like that just seems so vague and subjective? And yes, there's been Medicare manual guidance that the Medicare Benefit Policy Manual, Chapter 10, Section 20, that talks about these presumed criteria. And yes, one of those presumed criteria gets into the fact of an emergency situation. But then it's even what is an emergency situation? Of course, it's not defined there. Bottom line, this concept then of medical necessity is pretty darn subjective. And this, unfortunately or fortunately, however you want to look at it, is the biggest thing that these Medicare reviewers focus on in these prepayment and post-payment audits. And, their kind of logic becomes, well, I think this patient could have been transported by other means, wheelchair van, private vehicle, whatever. And it's like, how do we know? And of course we don't know. And the thing I love to say in presentations is, it'd be great if we did have a time machine. Let's go and transport this patient by ambulance and see what happens. Then we get in our time machine. We go back, then we put them in the wheelchair van and see what happens. Oh, they didn't get harmed by the wheelchair van transport. Okay, I guess they could have tolerated lesser forms. We can't compare and contrast. We've only transported them by one mode. And so, for people to throw in there kind of very subjective type conclusions, well, I think this could have been the case. I think they could have tolerated. We just simply don't know. So that's why sometimes, it all falls back to that crew documentation of, what are these patient conditions? What are they presenting with? What can they do? What can't they do? Why do they need the ambulance as opposed to other forms? And absolutely, if we're giving them interventions, starting IVs, medically necessary interventions, then yes, those things can't occur by other means. But yes, if we're just the fact that we did the transport, the fact that we might have been required to do the transport under our local treatment protocols, our state laws, whatever, doesn't always mean that you get to bill and get paid by a payer like Medicare. So it is this weird dichotomy at times between we have an obligation to transport by ambulance because that's what the state law says, but now we need to make sure we meet the coverage criteria for this payer, such as Medicare. And if medical necessity is not there and not documented, then maybe we need to think about that. But if we believe medical necessity is met, and a Medicare reviewer says, nope, sorry, I don't think so, this is exactly why we have the appeals process. In my experience, pretty darn close to like 50% or more of trips that have been denied for medical necessity have ultimately been overturned through a combination of redetermination, reconsideration, and ALJ level hearings. So these Medicare reviewers are 50% or more of the time wrong with their assessment of medical necessity. And we're able to make our arguments on appeal. Someone, cooler heads prevail at redetermination, reconsideration, or ALJ, whether it's we start making the argument better, whether it's these folks, these other reviewers realize that, hey, this is nuts for you to say this medical necessity isn't met, because there is just no standard rules and guidelines and whatnot. It is just a total wild, wild west free for all as far as what people think meet medical necessity.
Yeah, and we see that in the non-emergency context, the AL 428 context, all the time.
Yep.
Right. And our rate of getting it overturned on appeal is actually much higher than 50-50. More like 80 or 90, 20 or 10.
Right.
Which is, but I've never even seen it attacked on the emergency side. It's always been in the non-emergency context.
Yep. Yeah, we've seen with both emergency and non-emergency. It's rare for the emergency trips to be hit with medical necessity, but we've seen it.
Right.
You're right, Bill. I mean, it is the biggest audit area for non-emergency trips, and it's a testament to the good documentation and having enough. And just say, oh, the patient was bed confined. Oh, the patient was non-ambulatory. Oh, the patient is going for dialysis. That's not enough. You've got to have good, solid supporting documentation. And you're right. Very often pursuing appeals, you can kind of add a little bit of color. You can add a little bit more explanation. You can kind of, color it a little bit more. But time and time again, it's so unfortunate that there's not better guidance out there for these reviewers, because it becomes a waste of everybody's time, to have to pursue all these appeals and fight for what is clearly correct. But some knucklehead reviewer gave a bad answer that now everybody is fighting this, and it's wasting the times of the appeals people at the redetermined reconsideration ALJ. It's led to the backlog that used to be at the ALJ level that's now up there at the Departmental Appeals Board, because everybody who kept fighting these things, appeals going through the ALJ level, now they're stuck with like 12 people at the Departmental Appeals Board. I myself have 10 appeals that have been sitting there for going on 4 years now with not a peep from anybody.
Yeah, you guys did a great job for us on a very specific narrow issue related to specialty care transport. And I think it was also Steve, not Steve Worth, but Steve in your office and found some information because Medicare reviewers were trying to ask for medical necessity forms, PCSs, on SCTs, and those are by default in the system emergency calls. And there's like back and forth, and found great documentation, a great example of where Medicare is not always right. You know, we showed them in their own manuals, certainly with your office's help, that they were wrong.
Right. Right. And yeah, we see that all the time, you know, these, and that's they're coming up. I guess it's next week. I think it's next week. There's actually going to be this big call amongst all the different Medicare administrative contractors. And I'm not sure if it's going to be a complete debacle or if it's going to be something where good information comes of this, because unfortunately, you know, we've got the 6 or 7 different MACs across the country, and they kind of have their own philosophy, own way of doing things. And of course, you know, we had 2 of them originally doing the prior authorization, and the rest of them got on board with prior authorization. And we had, you know, Palmetto and Novitas well versed in this, and then the rest of them jumped on board, and it was a complete disaster. So at least getting them all in a room where they can talk about some of the common issues and maybe share some notes and some insight, maybe we can get you know, the downside though is, of course, you know, you get some folks like WPS out there where they don't recognize the concept of a lifetime signature, and they go and beat that drum, and the other payers go, oh yeah, we like that. We're not going to recognize a lifetime signature either. So, you know, do you get everybody else convincing WPS for the lifetime signature, or vice versa? And the same thing with medical necessity. I think we've got some MACs who are much better at kind of thinking big picture, forest through the trees thing, and making legitimate and reasonable decisions when it comes to medical necessity. Other ones that are just completely chaotic. One real quick side story, and this goes back several years to Noridian, where the Noridian medical director at the time was a big proponent of not needing to go by ambulance. And basically, you had to be on your deathbed to require ambulance, especially for non-emergency transports. And she was big with this study that they had done years ago in like Washington or Oregon State, and where people who had amputations and some people who had legs and arms amputated, they were like, well, we were able to prop them up and put them in a wheelchair and transport them by wheelchair van transport. So if these patients who, you know, don't have any extremities can be transported by wheelchair van, then we think that almost anybody could be transported by wheelchair van. And this concept and philosophy became kind of the norm for Noridian for quite some time, all because it was, you know, this concept coming out of the medical director, who then of course did the training for, hey, when you're doing audits of ambulance trips, think about this. You know, we can transport these patients that don't have any extremities by wheelchair van. So certainly you've got to practically be dead to go by ambulance. So, and when you see non-emergency trips come through, deny them for medical necessity. They can go by other means, because you get one person that kind of jades the whole philosophy of everybody else. And now, luckily, years have gone past. I think, you know, handling appeals and doing other stuff and fighting this, cooler heads have prevailed. But it's just, it shows how one person can totally influence everybody else by imparting their concepts and knowledge and theory of whether other forms of transport are contraindicated or not.
I just got one other quick one. On the signature side, you know, especially in the context of big city EMS, boy, I really have a hard time believing that those cats that are in a big city EMS system like Philly, New York, Houston, Dallas, you insert big city EMS system name here, is wrangling patient signatures. I mean I don't believe it.
And I agree with you, and I think we're starting to see and starting to get more people to realize, and the bigger problem with that is yes, I get it that sometimes in the field, yes, you're going to have reasons when you might not be able to get the signature, but I think what has been happening is across the board, because we've seen this practice in, you know, not just regionally but across the country, and luckily it has not been totally widespread, but I really do think there are a lot of cases where a crew member will say, who the heck knows what Mrs. Smith's signature looks like? I'm just going to sign a little scribble here and say that that's Mrs. Smith's signature. Who's going to know? What's the harm? Who's going to find out? Who's going to really know? I think the practice happens far more often than anyone is aware of. And again, the times that it becomes evident is when that signature then becomes captured, hours later, or AVL data shows that this vehicle was now driving away from the hospital at the exact time the signature of the alleged patient was captured. So yes, it's one thing if you say the patient was unable to sign and we've got a representative, or we've got the B6 signature being captured. I think it is a potentially huge problem in EMS of patient signatures being forged. I know there have been lots of
different thing.
yeah, and I think there have been people who have admitted to the problem and have taken their medicine and have gone through the OIG self-disclosure protocol because they wanted to do the right thing. I think it could be a big problem. I hope that more people are becoming aware of it. I hope that more people are looking out for it. I hope that people are reminding their crew members of the importance. And heck, worst case scenario, and we've seen this happen too, where signatures are not being captured in the field. You flag those crew members and you say, look, you've got to be the one to go and get this now. I don't care how you do it, but you're responsible for doing it. You can't just say, oh, we forgot to get the signature. Can't the billing folks do this? Can't they just mail something out after the fact? No, because that takes our time in the billing office. This is part of your job to get that patient signature. You can't be forging it. You can't have some bogus reason as to why the patient couldn't sign. So you're going to get the patient signature. You're going to give a good reason. You're going to do your job. And that's the way we've often couched it. I saw an entity where they posted signature defects and the rate of getting signatures from the patients in the field, and the bottom quartile percentage of folks that were doing a bad job of this were like publicly shamed on a cork board in the break room. And they wanted to get themselves off of that list. And heck, they were even going so far as to progressive discipline. If you fail to get signatures, we are going to discipline you. Your first offense is a written warning or verbal warning or whatever. And then the more offenses, we're going to get rid of you. Now, this was years ago. Certainly now when we've got bigger problems with getting warm bodies that can do this kind of thing, but it is a concern. Good documentation, good signature capture, it's always a huge concern. And finding the right thing to motivate the crews to get the job done the right way becomes difficult as well. And how do we do that? Through carrots or sticks or whatever.
Thanks, Dan. Do we have anyone else on the call that wants to throw a question out there to get on the record for everybody here at AIMHI to when they review this? All right. Hey, Dan, I know we've taken you over time a little bit, and everybody on the call, thanks for hanging in, but this was great. The getting it into the top 10 list was fantastic, and how you were able to get through it. It was amazing. That was great.
And now you can see why
we all
Dan
very
is
much
so-
appreciate you getting through this and doing this for us. And certainly we'll have a much bigger audience as this is recorded and will be put out to all of the AIMHI world. Thank you.
and
Yeah,
now
no
you know
problem.
Dan
Happy to
is
help.
worth his weight in gold.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks,
Have a good
everybody.
afternoon, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Dan.
Yep. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all.